Hi, I'm John Suzukida, and this is my parents' story, being Americans of Japanese ancestry, of being incarcerated during World War II in America's concentration camps. Thank you for hearing and listening to their story.
I have given this talk to quite a few people, and over time I've learned it's good to kind of characterize what it is and what it isn't. And so what it is it's really being done with the hope of helping to avoid us repeating mistakes that have been made in history. It's to talk about a topic that really is not always taught in school. Found a lot of discrepancy there, and a number of people that have never even been aware of this. Third is to leave a thoughtful audience with a different perspective, kind of a personal perspective. And that's the fourth point about what this is. It's really a personal, historic experience from my parents' documents and things they've said over time, from which I've pulled together this presentation. What it isn't. I'm not an expert on the topic. I am not an historian, and it's not a political commentary. It really isn't designed to be a political commentary. So these are my parents a few years after that time period. So I'll just jump right in just to give you a quick background beyond the sharing first grade. I was born and raised in Skokie, Illinois, and that becomes kind of significant. I'll come back to that toward the end of the talk. By education, I'm an engineer, mechanical engineer. I spent 22 years of marketing and executive management at a company called Train. And since 2002, I've been an independent business consultant. And I currently and have lived for 30 years in Shoreview, Minnesota, and have 3 adult children. So just kind of give you a context for where I'm coming from. And with that, I'm going to just jump right in. So as we know, the day of infamy, December 7th, 1941, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, within 4 days, the West Coast was declared a theater of war. Less than 2 months later, on February 19th, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which allowed the military to exclude any person from anywhere without trial or hearings, no due process. Pretty significant impact of executive orders. 6 days later, the Navy informed Japanese American residents of Terminal Island. Now, when you look at the map of California, there's a part of it that kind of swings back east. So the beaches actually face south. That's where Terminal Island is. And my mom lived there. They were told that they needed to leave within 48 hours with only the possessions they could carry. Now, spin has always been around, certainly nothing new, but this is an interesting application of it. The concentration camps, which by definition they really are when you're being held as a group in armed environments, it's typically defined as a concentration camp, were labeled relocation centers. There's also another interesting spin that was put on this. So 120,000 alien and non-alien residents of Japanese ancestry were relocated to 10 different concentration camps. Now, we all, I think, are familiar in the context of citizenship, what an alien means. And so the double negative of a non-alien resident obviously is a citizen, but you wouldn't want to put that on the posters and the other things that came out about this. So the term non-alien was used, and later I'll show you a picture of a poster with that wording. Of the 120,000 people, 2/3 of them were US citizens. And I'll touch in a moment on why that was the case. Okay, so I am 3rd generation Japanese American, and I'll explain in just a moment. But ironically, I've consulted for a company based out of Japan for a number of years. And they, I think I kind of confused them at first because I don't speak any Japanese. And so after observing me for a while, they concluded that I had Japanese hardware and American software. And it pretty much kind of nails it. So with that, I'm going to teach you 2 Japanese words, having just said that I don't speak Japanese, but I'm going to teach you 2 words because they're kind of important in this context. The first one is Issei, and those are the 1st generation immigrants, all of whom were denied US citizenship due to being Japanese. And so the Asian exclusion law prevented them from becoming citizens, no matter how long they lived here. The second word is Nisei, and those are the second generation, obviously born in the United States. So my grandparents were Issei. They arrived in the US between the years 1899 and 1914, driven by economic opportunity, similar to many immigrants historically. My parents then were Nisei, so they were born and raised in the US. It was both the Nisei and the Issei who were incarcerated in America's concentration camps. Now, to the extent that there is such a thing, right? My parents had somewhat of an all-American childhood. My dad wrote the school song for the high school he went to, the John Marshall High School. It was one of 3 high schools where the movie Grease was filmed. He led various clubs and sang in the Glee Club. On my mom's side, my grandfather was a big baseball fan. And so he used to bring my mom to Cub games, the spring training games in the 1920s in Los Angeles's Wrigley Field on Catalina Island. So PK Wrigley built a spring training ballpark there and a hotel so he could watch from the hotel down to see what was going on the field. But my grandfather used to bring my mom to that. She was a lifelong Cub fan as a result. And that's a story that if Jack hasn't already told you, I'm sure he can mention to you at some point in time, is tied to the Cubs. So digging through my parents' paperwork, one of the things that I found was this. And so this was is the school song. As far as I know, it's still being used at John Marshall High School. And at the bottom, the words are written by Henry Suzukida. Winter of '38 is when he graduated high school. So it's interesting, you know, your parents tell you a lot of things when you're growing up, but I actually hadn't seen the school song that he mentioned that he'd written until I found it in their paperwork. So all of that is to kind of give you a background and a context. And what I'm going to do now is shift from my articulating these things to using both of my parents' words. They spent time writing these things down, and it was invaluable in pulling together this information. So with this picture as a background, I'm going to read, starting with some of my dad's words in this time. Following the outbreak of hostilities between Japan and America, the plate glass window of the family restaurant we owned was smashed several times. After the window was broken the second time, the insurance company canceled our policy. On December 10th, someone posted a sign on our door that read, "Open season on Japs. This is a Jap joint. We are at war with Japan." Surprisingly, the restaurant became busier than ever. Old customers from far away flocked in to reassure us that they considered us loyal Americans and would continue to patronize our cafe. However, the federal government froze our bank accounts. The state of California revoked our beer and wine licenses and took away our sales tax permit, which meant we could no longer conduct a business in the state. Knowing that we were moving, we made preparations to sell the restaurant. A buyer was found and the final transaction was made after we entered Santa Anita. I'll come back to that in a moment, but Santa Anita is currently and still is a horse racing track. Frank, my dad's brother, received a mere fraction of the restaurant's actual worth. Mama sold a piano for $5. I sold my Ford for $25. My brother-in-law sold his international truck for $45. Each family was assigned a family number. Ours was number 18257. Each of us was allowed to take only 2 bags. This is a front and back picture of a bag that belonged to my uncle, Barry. So on one side, on the left side there, you can see number 18257, and the name of the camp after Santa Anita that they were sent to was in Granada, Colorado. And on the right side there, you see his name, Barry Suzukida. Continuing with my dad's words, on May 1, 1942, members of my family were interned at the Santa Anita racetrack, which had been renamed Santa Anita Assembly Center. Altogether, there were about 18,000 men, women, and children of Japanese ancestry placed there under protective custody. About 2/3 of those herded into camp were US citizens, and the balance were those of my parents' generation who had come from Japan but were not citizens because the Asian exclusion law prohibited that. They were also prohibited from owning land in their name. How were the stalls where they kept the horses used? The evacuees lived in them, and the odor of horses remained even though the evacuees tried to sanitize them. There were barbed wires all along the fences surrounding the Santa Anita Assembly Center. We were under surveillance of armed soldiers from atop watchtowers. We really couldn't believe it because we had not done anything wrong. There was a bed count every morning and night by persons we called woodpeckers because they knocked on the wooden barrack doors to check up on our presence. Now, many years ago, I had a chance to visit Santa Anita racetrack with my dad and a couple of my siblings. And it was during the weekdays, and so they were closed. I think they operate mostly during the weekends. And we stood there at the outside of the fence looking at the stands and the area, and he was describing where they stayed. And he was a very good singer. That capability did not pass down to me, but he was a very good singer and loved to lead large groups in song. And so they'd be a lot of people sitting up in the bleachers, and he'd be down leading them through songs, doing anything they could to keep their morale up. I'm going to switch from here to some of my mom's words at the same time, concurrently with what my dad was saying. Furnishings worth $50 to $200 went for $4 or $5. Strangers with trucks were waiting until the Japanese moved out. They hauled away whatever they wanted. Relatives, friends, and persons from other groups like the Quakers came to help. However, jobbers, opportunists, used furniture dealers all came in droves like vultures. I remember that we sold the large safe that was in the store for $5, and before it was moved, the buyer sold it for a much higher price to someone else. Prior to our sudden departure from Terminal Island, living with armed guards present at all times, with unannounced raids by officials, our lives were in constant turmoil. All public gatherings were banned, except for religious services. Now remember, my mom's area was one of the first to be evacuated, and they had 48 hours. 48 hours was the smallest amount of time that people were given to evacuate. Some had longer, a few days longer. But when you think about all the things happened from the time the poster that I'll show you in just a moment was put up, posters were put up on telephone poles announcing all of this, and how many things they had to do to sell stores, sell businesses, sell inventory, close things down, take care of their houses, try to figure out what happens to belongings, and then be ready to leave carrying only what you could carry, either 2 of the assigned bags or suitcases that you could carry. Now, one of the things that I'm sure you have all experienced, and I know that I think everybody does, and that is that sometimes in the worst of times, the best parts of human nature come out. Earlier, I related the story where people from far away came in to bring business to my father's family restaurant. My mother's family had a similar experience. Evidently, my grandfather had befriended a young Levi Strauss salesman when he was first breaking in. He owned a dry goods, my grandfather owned a dry goods store, and he helped this young salesman learn the ropes of what to do in the business. And so at the time, my grandfather passed away before the war, before 1940. And when that happened, the salesman came in to help my grandmother get things in order so that she could keep the store going. And then when he heard about all of this going on, he came and bought back everything that he had sold them at the price that he had sold those products for. And so when you think about the environment of all the things going on and vultures coming in, opportunists coming in, that Levi Strauss salesman came in and handled things very appropriately. So the best parts of human nature can come through. Okay, so this is a picture of the posters back in those days. They would take these and wrap them around telephone poles and staple them or pin them in. And this was kind of the form of communication. And it basically is giving instruction for Americans of Japanese descent where they had to go, what they could carry, where they had to report, and all of the rules that were involved around the evacuation. So with that, I'm going to continue with some of my mom's words. Dr. John W. Thomas, Secretary for the Department of Cities for the American Baptist Home Mission Society, came from New York headquarters to see what was happening to the Japanese Americans when the possibility of evacuation was discussed. He became a frequent visitor to Poston. Poston, Arizona is where my mother's family was kept. He learned that my education had been delayed because of father's death. A few months later, he asked if I'd like to finish my college education. Because the church had stood by us during both of our upheavals, my mom's father passing away, and then of course this, I chose to go into Christian work. As I searched for schools, I discovered that the Eastern Baptist Theological Seminary near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, offered a Bachelor of Religious Education. I applied and was accepted. I was seated in the back of an Army truck with open sides, leaving Poston for the Parker, Arizona train station on October 10th, 1942. The WRA, the War Relocation Authority, paid the train fare and provided $25 spending money. I arrived October 12th, 1942, a full month after classes had begun in September. Now, this picture on the right is a picture of my mom and her brother, who became a United Church of Christ minister. This is about the era, the time, the age that they were when they were plucked out of their daily lives and put in Poston, Arizona. The letter on the left is fascinating and depressing. We've all watched old war movies, especially European war movies, where you're crossing borders and you have to have your papers, all that type of thing. This is the paper that my mother had to have on her possession. It was the travel from Arizona to Philadelphia as a college student and a U.S. citizen. The significance of that is a little mind-boggling. The stationery is Eastern Baptist Theological Seminary, which she attended, and it was signed by a member of the military. And basically, in it, I won't read through the whole thing, but basically it just says the bearer of this is so-and-so, and she's this age, and here's where she's going, and she has to report there by a certain time. And she had to carry these papers with her in order to travel. It is unimaginable to any one of us who are used to the freedom that we have in the United States. This is a picture of the camp. We did have a chance to see the Smithsonian exhibit with my mom. I wanted my kids to see it with her when it was a large exhibit was being exhibited at the Smithsonian in DC. And her comments were that it was very accurate. The way they pulled it together, the barracks that they had in there. She said the memories, out in the middle of the desert, is, in the desert, not only does it get hot during the day, it typically gets cold during night. And also when the wind blows, which it does often, frequently, she said sand was always everywhere because these barracks were pretty much slapped together with slats of wood put together. So sand was always sifting in. So these are the barracks that were split up into quarters. So each family had a quarter of the barrack in front of us. Also, the standard size barracks were used for bathrooms. And she described kind of the loss of dignity or lack of dignity with the way the bathroom arrangements were set up. It was basically stool after stool lined up with no partitions between the stools. And of course, when all you have is what you can carry, you don't just have extra sheets or things that you can put up between them. And she related that the many things that happened as being just a loss of dignity in the places in which they needed to use the facilities. Okay, so I am going to switch from sharing my parents' words. I'll come back with a few more comments towards the end, but I want to give you a little bit more context of the war and some of the things that went on that not a lot of people are familiar with. So before I forget, to bring this up. There was a relatively new book called Facing the Mountain, and it's written by Daniel James Brown. If anyone's ever read the historical Boys in the Boat, same author. This book, Facing the Mountain, is an extremely good book. Great research that was done using insight from people that were survivors of the story that I'm about to tell you. So this is the story of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the 100th Battalion that were made up of all Japanese American troops. They were involved in October of 1944 in a rescue of what was called the Lost Battalion. It was a unit of the Texas 36th Infantry Division that was being cut off basically in France's Vosges Mountains. Literally the words that were used, they were cut off and being chewed up. And so the 442nd was sent in and incurred 800 casualties, rescuing the 211 members over a period of 6 days. The book, and there's a movie as well on this, actually a movie made in the 50s, which is really interesting that short after the end of World War II, that such a movie would be made regarding the Japanese American bravery in going after and rescuing the Texas troops. It was then and continues to be the most decorated unit in American history, with you can read the 8 presidential citations and 300+% casualties. Now, from a numbers standpoint, 23,000 Nisei, those are the second generation U.S. soldiers, U.S. citizens, served in the military. Many decorations, 18,000 for bravery, including a Medal of Honor, 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, 28 with oak leaf clusters, and 9,486 Purple Hearts. Additionally, 6,000 served in the Army Military Intelligence Specialists in the Pacific, and they were credited with shortening the war by 2 years by General MacArthur's intelligence chief, General Charles Willoughby. Now, it's interesting for me to have read these things and gone through my mom's material. She's the one who put together kind of a family book of this material. And then not too long after putting this together, talking to one of my cousin's wives, whose father was in the 442nd. And she sent me a picture here of a memorial in Los Angeles. At the top, you can see the words "Go for broke." That was their motto. When in essence, they were being pulled out of prison. One of the things that my mom related, both my mom and dad related, was that when they were incarcerated, they felt like it was for life. I mean, what else could they think, right? They were told to get rid of everything, bring what you could carry, and here's where you are. And there are many stories of basically guard towers around all of these. There were stories of people that got too close to the fence, an older man walking his dog, and he got too close to the fence and got shot. In that type of environment, to be pulled out of there and volunteer to serve in U.S. military, they had something to prove. And it got captured in those words, "Go for broke." Now, in the lower right-hand corner, the chain kind of gets in the way there a little bit there, but you see a quote from Major General Charles Willoughby, who is referred to there as MacArthur's intelligence chief, that says, "The Nisei saved countless lives and shortened the war by 2 years." Very interesting to see that memorial. Now, I live in Minnesota. And interestingly enough, Minnesota was chosen as a place in the country that would most likely have the best reception to placing the military MIS group at a place where they could learn Japanese. And so it started out in the Presidio in San Francisco, but as you can imagine, the environment in California was not great for pulling together thousands of U.S. citizen Japanese Americans to learn Japanese. And so that didn't go well. And they found Savage, Minnesota, and established Camp Savage as a place to bring people to learn. And after a while, actually, the numbers grew large enough that they ended up needing to move to Fort Snelling, which is right at the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport. Now, because you are where you are, sitting where you are, I think it's worthwhile to just give a quick read through to give a sense for what this says. This is a road marker that captures what's going or what was behind Camp Savage. During World War II, some 5,000 to 6,000 Japanese American soldiers, members of U.S. military's military intelligence service, were given intensive and accelerated classes in the Japanese language at Camp Savage. Their subsequent work translating captured documents, maps, battle plans, diaries, letters, and printed materials, and interrogating Japanese prisoners made them, quote, our human secret weapon, unquote, according to President Harry Truman, who commended them following the war. The Military Intelligence Service, MIS program, began in the fall of 1941, a few weeks before Pearl Harbor at the Presidio in San Francisco. For security reasons, it was moved in May of 1942 to Camp Savage, a site personally selected by Language School Commandant Colonel Carl E. Rasmussen, who believed Savage was, quote, a community that would accept Japanese Americans for their true worth, American soldiers fighting with their brains for their native America, unquote. The 132-acre site had served as a civilian conservation corps camp in the 30s and was later used to house elderly indigent men. Conditions there were extremely difficult in the early months of the war when the first students studied without desks, chairs, or even beds. By August 1944, the program had outgrown Camp Savage and was moved to larger facilities at Fort Snelling. Most of the English-speaking Japanese Americans, known as Nisei, were from the West Coast area. Some were already in the U.S. military service when they were selected for the language school, while others were volunteered from the camps in which American citizens of Japanese ancestry had been interned following the bombing of Pearl Harbor. According to General Charles Willoughby, Chief of Intelligence for General Douglas MacArthur, the 6,000 Nisei shortened the Pacific War by 2 years. Now, there's always a lot of ironies in any kind of war, but of those, there's three I'd like to point out. Of the 6,000 Japanese Americans in the MIS, less than 10% spoke or understood any Japanese. And even of I think the total came out to be 9%. There are various degrees of know a few words, know some words, and, expert. And the experts were somewhere in the 2 to 3%. And so just one of the ironies here is that they were brought in to learn Japanese. Second one is they were incarcerated really due to the fear that they were communicating with Japan, and yet not one incident was ever found. And third, the time spent in Camp Savage and Fort Snelling learning Japanese language really enabled them to be effective. After learning Japanese and being able to go in and help interrogate soldiers and figure out what was going on, it's just very ironic that that whole situation happened. And this is not something typically that you learn readily in history books. One of the questions that was asked of the internees were these two questions. Question number 27 was, are Nisei men willing to serve on combat duty wherever ordered? So the question that came up was, does putting yes there, yes or no, does that mean you're volunteering? What does it really mean? There's no room for interpretation. Question number 28 asked, if individuals would swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and forswear any form of allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. Well, again, 2/3 were born in the US. And so if you never held a loyalty to the Emperor, how can you forswear allegiance? And for the 1/3 that were, like my grandparents, had been in the country for almost 40 years, because they were Japanese immigrants, were barred from becoming US citizens due to the Asian exclusion law. Renouncing the one place where you do have citizenship to a country that won't allow you to be a citizen kind of leaves you hanging in the middle. And those are two questions that caused a lot of concerns, and you can imagine over time. Okay. There we go. So my parents' post-war experiences. My mom ended up graduating with a Bachelor of Divinity degree and spent her life working only in church-related activities because of what various denominations and various churches had done for them over that time. My dad, if you can imagine, being in your mid-20s, getting out of the camps, moved to Chicago because a couple of his brothers had moved there, and he had a hard time finding a job. But he ended up getting a job with the Lincoln National Life Insurance Company and spent the rest of his life working for them. They concertedly chose a non-Japanese American community, and they chose basically to assimilate. And so what that meant was in 1957, my three older sisters were born and going to school. And basically, my parents were looking for good schools, better education. And as they went through the home buying experience, they faced quite a bit of discrimination. You know, typically what would happen then, and we like to think it doesn't happen now, but I'm sure there are exceptions to that. My parents, because they spoke perfect English, of course, that's really their primary language, would call about a place and they'd say, sure, come out and take a look. And they'd get there and the place inevitably would have just sold, just wasn't available any longer. So they had been through that experience several times. And when my dad had just recovered from the flu and he was still feeling a little bit weak, and they lived in the south side of Chicago and had found this home on the north side in Skokie. And he called the realtor about this and said, you know, I just want to be upfront. I'm an American of Japanese descent. And if that's a problem, I understand. I just don't have the energy to drive up if we're not going to be able to see the home. And the realtor said something very interesting, and I'm not comfortable saying exactly what he said. So I'm going to ask you to use your street interpretation of my carefully worded quote here. And that is that the realtor said, well, the builder is of Polish descent, and I, the realtor, am of Italian descent. And I don't really care what you are. If you want to look at the house, come look at the house. And so he did, and they ended up buying the house, and that's how we ended up in Skokie. One of the things about Skokie is it's kind of a unique place. It was certainly a unique place back in the era when Jack and I grew up. And that was that it was about, I don't know if it was numerically exactly half, but pretty close, I believe, half German and half Jewish, which especially back in the late 50s was kind of an unusual situation. And so given that, in 1977, in fact, there was a movie made in this regard called Skokie. The Nazi Party decided they wanted to march in Skokie. And I won't go into long detail on that, but it did end up, the decision ended up going to the Supreme Court. It's not exactly a straight line from there to the Second Amendment or to the right to speak, but basic freedom of speech. But basically, the ruling came back down that they had the right to march. And they fortunately chose not to, and to avoid the potential problems that would come about as a result of that. But from my perspective, growing up as a minority within a minority is a fascinating way to grow up. And all of this, all the things that I just went through, could be put in perspective, at least in my mind, by one memory of being at a friend's house, and his grandmother was there, and she rolled up her sleeves and showed me the tattoo on her arm as a survivor of Auschwitz. And it puts quite a perspective on all of this, to grow up as a Japanese American in a Jewish community. Half of the town that I lived in was on the Jewish side, and for a long time, Jack, as you'll recall, I think it took him a few years before they actually ended up doing holidays and no school for Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah. But there were many days, or those holidays in the first couple of years, where there were about 5 of us in school. So my parents ended up sending 5 kids through the University of Illinois They don't offer any group discounts. Send one or send 4 through, get 1 free, nothing like that. But they sent all 5 of us through University of Illinois. I mentioned the Smithsonian exhibit. Okay, so the Civil Liberties Act was signed actually by Ronald Reagan in October of 1988 with a congressional apology, and a $20,000 reparation check was given to all survivors of the concentration camps. So what I have here on the left-hand side is the check that was written to my father and the letter that was sent to him signed by George Herbert Walker Bush. And I'll tell you, the letter is the thing that meant the most, that it was a public apology signed by the current president of the United States, and also getting the congressional apology. Now, interestingly, there were more than Japanese Americans that were affected under Executive Order 9066. As I mentioned, of course, 120,000 Japanese Americans, but additionally 10,905, just under 11,000 German Americans, and a little over 3,000 Italian Americans were incarcerated, and additionally 10,000 or so Italian Americans were relocated from the coastal zones. So in 2004, Congress, it's hard to imagine them doing anything unanimously, but they did. They named the anniversary of the signing of Executive Order 9066, February 19th, as the National Day of Remembrance. Okay, I'm going to go back to a few of my father's words at this point. This is following his release from the camps. I moved to Chicago the latter part of January 1944. The U.S. government gave me $50 and a railroad ticket. I was enriched by the camp experiences, and I'm not bitter towards any person or the country of my birth for having been put through the experiences. I believe honestly that I'm a better American for what my family and I endured. No group of Americans should have to be subjected to such treatment. It might be looked back upon as an experience or happening in the United States of America that was a result of our own immaturity as a democracy. I read those words posthumously. I wish I had read and known that my dad had written those words before he passed away. They're kind of a mind-boggling that he would have that perspective and that level of forgiveness and magnanimous wording. I'd like to finish on a positive note. I personally have a philosophy that things get better over time. I couldn't find anything better than EKG here, but I guess it's appropriate for what I'm about to say. I just, things are good times or bad times. This is the way life goes, right? But I really believe that over time, and maybe it's my engineering thing, but if you look at those curves, that there's a growth curve, where over time things do get better. So arguably we're going through perhaps one of the tough times again, but we go through these periods of time, and I really believe that. This picture captured it for me. I shared with you what my mother went through. You picture her on the back of an army truck, hopping on to go to college, being released to go to college, and then having to carry your papers to travel as a US citizen across the country. Can you imagine going from that type of thing and experience as a young woman to being able to be at the graduation of her granddaughter, my daughter, from medical school in 2 generations, to go from the type of discrimination and circumstances that they faced being put in concentration camps, and within 2 generations being able to have that type of change happen? That is one of the reasons that I feel like the slope of the curve is up over time in our society. And my own view of that is what makes America great. This, I showed you the picture earlier of my mother and her brother at about the time that they were in the camps. This is a picture of their descendants who came together when she passed away at the age of 94. And she was most proud of the level of education that her family had been able to attain. Education was very important to her. It was significant because that is why she was released early out of the camps to be able to go to college. I'm going to wrap with the words that I mentioned before that my dad said. It might be looked back upon as an experience or happening in the United States of America that was a result of our own immaturity as a democracy. The significance of those words are that it's not like it's written in stone how a democracy can and should survive and endure and grow and improve. We make mistakes. We have to get over them and move on. And that's my positive outlook on the fact that it's always been the case. And I believe it's just continuing to get better as long as we keep our eye on really where we're going and who we are.